Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 16, Text 32. Dvasthavadishya Bhagava Vimana Shreni Bhushanam Sarvatishayaya Lakshmya Jushtam Swam Dhishnyamavisha. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. After thus speaking at the door of Vaikuntha, the Lord returned to His abode, where there are many celestial airplanes and all surpassing wealth and splendor. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. It is clear from this verse that all the incidents took place at the entrance of Vaikuntha Loka. In other words, the sages were not actually within Vaikuntha Loka, but were at the gate. It could be asked, how could they return to material world if they entered Vaikuntha Loka? But factually, they did not enter, and therefore they returned. There are many similar incidents where great yogis and brahmanas, by dint of their yoga practice, have gone from this material world to Vaikuntha Loka, but they were not meant to stay there. They came back. It is also confirmed here that the Lord was surrounded by many Vaikuntha airplanes. Vaikuntha Loka is described here as having splendid opulence, far surpassing the splendor of this material world. All other living creatures, including the demigods, are born of Brahma, and Brahma is born of Lord Vishnu. Krishna states in the Bhagavad Gita, in the 10th chapter, Aham Sarvasya Prabhavaha. Lord Vishnu is the origin of all manifestations in the material world. Those who know that Lord Vishnu is the origin of everything, who are conversant with the process of creation, and who understand that Vishnu or Krishna is the most worshipable object of all living entities, engage themselves in Vishnu worship as Vaishnavas. The Vedic hymns also confirm this. Om Tad Vishnu Paramam Padam. The goal of life is to understand Vishnu. The Bhagavatam also confirms this elsewhere. Foolish people, not knowing that Vishnu is the supreme worshipable object, create so many worshipable objects in this material world, and therefore they fall down. Thus ends the Bhaktivedanta purport. So here, in this verse, it is said that after thus speaking at the door of Vaikuntha, so this whole incidence between Vishnu, the four Kumaras, the sages, and Jaya and Vijaya, the doorkeepers, they are happening at the entrance of Vaikuntha. It is not inside the Vaikuntha. That is a point that is coming out in this verse. The Lord, so after speaking at the door of Vaikuntha, the Lord returned to His abode. And in His abode, what is there in His abode? There are many celestial airplanes, all surpassing wealth and splendor. Even the airplanes are surpassing wealth and splendor. So you can imagine how the spiritual world is if the airplanes themselves have to have this wonderful opulent characteristics. So here Prabhupada is mentioning in the purport what was the reason that the four Kumaras returned. Because it is said Yat gatva na nivartante tadhama paramam mama. Krishna is telling Arjuna that if you reach Yat gatva na, once we reach the spiritual world, na nivartante, there is no return back from the spiritual world. So why did they return? Because Prabhupada is mentioning here, how could they return if they entered Vaikuntha Loka? The fact is that this whole incident took place at the gate of Vaikuntha. So they had actually not entered the Vaikuntha Loka. Actually, if we read in the previous chapters, it is mentioned that what led to all these incidences of Kumaras reaching at the door of Vaikuntha. When the demigods, they all approached Brahma because there was darkness spread all over the universe. The demigods didn't know what is the cause for this darkness. And so they approached Brahma. And Brahma, because he knew what was the actual facts of the matter, he knew that this is due to Diti bearing two demons, Hiranyaksha and Hiranyakashipu, and that's why this darkness has spread all over the world. And when there is dark, the demigods, they were afraid and they came and they told Brahma that due to this darkness, all our activities are suspended, we are not able to do our normal functions, we are not able to do anything, please help us. Just like if there's darkness all over the place, we cannot do anything, right? We can chant Hare Krishna Mahamantra nicely. Except for that, we cannot do practically anything when there is darkness. So such was the situation created in the heavenly planet, in the material world, in the upper planetary system. So the demigods didn't know, they approached Brahma, and they were all disturbed and perturbed. So Brahma, all the demigods have come to them with a problem. They're all, disturbed. So what did Brahma do? What is the best thing to do when we are all disturbed and full of anxieties? We have to absorb ourselves in the wonderful narrations of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Shravanam, Kirtanam, discuss about His glories. That's the best way to come out of the darkness of ignorance. So a similar situation was created amongst the demigods. So Brahma, to get rid of that, he started describing the wonderful nature of the spiritual world. So Brahma started this description and he told the demigods that he also described about the four Kumaras. The four Kumaras were Brahma's own sons, the first created living entities, and they were the predecessors of the demigods. So Brahma started describing the nature of the spiritual world, and he also described what happened when the four Kumaras entered the spiritual world. The spiritual world was so nice, so full of opulence, so many nice things. So Brahma did this because he was thinking that by these descriptions, the demigods will be relieved of all their material miseries. Now, the four Kumaras, when they entered, who are these four Kumaras? We have been hearing a lot about these four Kumaras. These four Kumaras, the whole incident took place because Jaya and Vijaya could not recognize the transcendental position of these childlike personalities. Had they been regular grown-up sages, they wouldn't have been stopped at the doorway. Why were they stopped? Because the Jaya and Vijaya couldn't recognize them. So why did the four Kumaras, although they're supposed to be the oldest, they were still just they were appearing like 5-year-old children. So why is that? These four Kumaras, when they were born, they were actually supposed to be Prajapatis. They were actually supposed to, create progeny. But because they were not ordinary souls, they were self-realized. They knew that for self-realization, celibacy is very important. We have to control our senses. Without controlling our senses, it is impossible to advance in self-realization. And they also knew, it's a known fact, that senses become very uncontrolled when we grow. But for a child, the senses don't disturb him, because the child's senses hasn't developed to the point where it will start bothering him. when to the point where it will start agitating him. So the 4 Kumaras thought they didn't want to take any chances. They thought instead of growing the normal way and then trying to control the senses, then trying to fight with controlling the senses, better let us remain young, so that we will not have to face the wrath of our senses. So that's how they remained young. And they always remained at that age. So when these 4 Kumaras, when they were entering the Vaikuntha Loka, they were like childlike. A child, whenever he is going around, any place he goes, generally a child is not stopped anywhere. Like if you see some places it will be written, trespassers will be prosecuted, right? But actually if a child goes and trespasses, nobody will actually prosecute him because he is a child. So a child is welcome to go anywhere that he wishes to go and he'll not be stopped. But sometimes if a child is stopped from going somewhere, he will naturally become little angry. He will start crying, right? But now these childlike, saintly personalities, the 4 Kumaras, they were not ordinary children. They were self-realized souls. So when they were stopped, they did not cry. They became upset and they cursed the doorkeepers, Jaya and Vijaya. This is what happened. And we have been reading in the last few verses how this entire thing was a plan of the Lord. Because the Lord wanted to fight, and He cannot fight in the spiritual world. The fighting has to happen in the material world. And who will actually be fighting with the Lord? They cannot be ordinary people. They have to be the devotees of the Supreme Lord. So the Lord arranged this entire thing in a way that Jaya and Vijaya are cursed and they come back to this material world. And then the fighting happens. Here it is said that they were stopped at the gate. When the 4 Kumaras were entering, at which there were 7 gates to the spiritual world. The 7th gate finally led to the actual entry of the spiritual world. So when it is mentioned in the Bhagavatam that when Jaya and Vijaya were coming, they crossed the first gate, they crossed the second gate, and in none of these gates they were stopped. And a very beautiful description of these gates are mentioned. They were all decorated with gold, studded with jewels, gems, diamonds. Imagine if you go to some place, we generally go to some museums or somewhere and we see such gates. I don't think it's there anymore here in this material world. Gates studded with gems and diamonds and made out of gold. Such things are only available as small pieces of jewelry because they are so valuable. So imagine if you see such gates, you'll be stunned by it, right? And you will just be looking at that and you'll not be looking anywhere here and there. But the 4 Kumaras, it is said that they were so much absorbed in the thoughts of meeting the Supreme Personality of Godhead and having His darshan. They were so much absorbed in that they did not look around what the gate was, what it was decorated with, or how opulent it was. They just went straight. And one after the other, they went on going, and at the 7th gate, they encountered these 2 personalities. And these 2 personalities were surprised to see these 4 small children, as to who they were, and that's how they were stopped, and that's how this whole incident happened. So here it is said that in the spiritual world there are many celestial airplanes, all surpassing wealth and splendor. Here it is mentioned what kind of airplanes were there in the spiritual world. The inhabitants of Vaikuntha travel in their airplanes made of lapis lazuli. Vaidurya. The airplanes are made of Vaidurya, lapis lazuli is what Prabhupada translates it as. And then it is made up of Marakata. It is made of emeralds. Hema. And the whole airplane is made of gold. Mayer Vimanaihi. So Vimana, the airplanes are made of such wonderful opulent things, gold, emeralds, lapis lazuli. And these airplanes are available only in the spiritual world. We have an experience of what the airplane is in the material world. In the material world, we see a gross airplane, right? It's called an airship. And with this gross airship, you can travel only a few thousand kilometers, 10,000 kilometers, and nothing more than that. And it can only remain in this planet. It cannot go beyond this planet. Although we are trying a lot to create some airships which can go to other planets, but so far we haven't been successful. A higher nature of airplane, this is a material airplane, gross airplane. A still finer, higher airplane is the subtle airplanes. That's called mind ships. We have the airship, the second level is called the mind ship. With the mind ships, the yogis have created this. They, with this mind ship, they can travel, we are restricted to travel only in this material planet. The yogis can travel not just on this material planet, they can go to anywhere, any planet in this material world. But their mind ships are also restricted to the topmost planet of this material world. And what is the speed of mind ship? It is, in one sense, infinite. You just think of something and you are there. Bhagavatam mentions that even if somebody is traveling with the speed of mind, for many, many millions and millions of years, he still cannot reach the spiritual world, the Vaikuntha Loka. Because that is, for that, a different qualification is required. So, and now coming to the next plane, the airplanes in the spiritual world, we had the airplane, the airship, the mind ship, and the spiritual airplanes. Those airplanes are like this, such beautiful airplanes, and those airplanes can travel anywhere in the material world, anywhere in the spiritual world. So, if you have to go to the spiritual world, we have to engage in devotional service of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. By no other yogic methods, nothing can take us to the spiritual world. It is said, there are two kinds of yogis. One is the Jnana yogi, or yogis who are, here it is mentioned that, but factually they did not enter. There are many similar incidences where great yogis and brahmanas, by dint of the yoga practice, have gone from the material world to the Vaikuntha Loka, but they were not meant to stay there. This is basically referring to the pastimes, incidences of Durvasa Muni, where he went, but he came back. And Bhrigu Muni also, he went. Of course, they were for different reasons. But here it is said, the yogis cannot stay there, they come back. Now, the two most popular type of yogis are the Jnana yogis and the Ashtanga yogis. The Jnana yogis, they can at most, they try the Jnana yoga process, but the Jnana yoga process cannot help them to attain a permanent position in the spiritual world. They fall back because after a Jnana yogi is thinking of the impersonal Brahman, so he will go and merge into the impersonal Brahma Jyoti, but because there are no engagements in that plane, he returns. He returns from that region. The Ashtanga yogi also, he is thinking of the Supreme Personality of Godhead in his heart as Super Soul, is meditating on that. But there are chances that even an Ashtanga yogi will return. The best example is Vishwamitra Muni. He was actually an Ashtanga yogi, meditating on the Supreme Personality of Godhead within his heart. And he also actually couldn't, be successful in the yoga process. Success in yoga is actually going back to the spiritual world. So he also returned. So it is only a bhakta who is engaged in bhakti yoga who can go back to the spiritual world. And Bhagavatam describes this in a very nice phrase. It's called Bhagavat Banaha. What is Bhagavat Banaha? How a bhakta yogi, a bhakti yoga, he surpasses the regions of impersonal Brahman, surpasses the region of localized Paramatma, and without taking the trouble of going through the difficult process of Jnana Yoga, Ashtanga Yoga, he directly goes to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So the term used is Bhagavat Banaha. Banaha is an arrow. Now arrow, when we talk of an arrow, there are three things that comes to our mind. One is, where is the arrow aiming towards? For the Jnana Yogis, the arrow is, there's a regular arrow, it's aiming towards impersonal realization, and they don't want to go beyond that. So the arrow ends there. For a Jnana Yogi, it's the understanding their destination, arrow as a destination. For them, it is the localized Paramatma. But for devotees, they are aiming with that arrow to reach the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And when we talk of an arrow, there are two more things that comes to our mind. One is how sharp the arrow is. And the other, how swift the arrow can be. Because it should reach the target very quickly, without delay. So it is described, Bhakti Yoga process is like a Bhagavat Banaha. Meaning to say, this arrow is actually aimed towards the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And this arrow is so sharp, that it can penetrate the regions of the impersonal Brahman Jyoti. It can penetrate the regions of the understanding of Paramatma. And it can directly, very quickly, swiftly reach the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Without actually going through or taking the trouble of actually understanding these lower processes. So if we engage in devotional service, we can actually surpass. It is said that if a devotee who is engaged in devotional service actually has surpassed all the rules and regulations and the studies of all the Vedas and is directly engaged in devotional. A devotee who is engaged in devotional service, he doesn't want anything beyond the service of the Lord. It is so, that service of the Lord is so pleasing. It's so, generally when we are engaged, just like the Jnana Yogis or the Ashtanga Yogis, when they are engaged in something, this knowledge, speculation, realization, they are desiring something. They want to merge with the Supreme Person. They want to merge in the Brahman Jyoti. They want to, they have a desire. But a devotee has no desire. Why a devotee has no desire? It is said that the engagement of devotee in devotional service is giving a devotee so much pleasure that he doesn't ask for any benediction, anything from the Lord. It is just like if you have the honey bees. When honey bees, they go to a parijata tree, the parijata tree, they can collect so much, they can collect unlimited amounts of honey from a parijata tree. So a honey bee hasn't got to go to another tree because so much of honey, so much of nectar is there in the parijata tree that it is very happy and very satisfied. And it doesn't want to go anywhere else. So in the same way, and this parijata tree, Prabhupada writes, it is actually the tree in the spiritual world, Kalpa Vriksha tree, which can give anything that a devotee wants. So they said, now this tree is in the spiritual world, right? Now there is a representation of the parijata tree in the material world also. And what is that? Prabhupada writes, it's the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The devotees are so attached to serving the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and they're relishing that service so much, they're enjoying that so much, that they're not interested in anything else but engagement in the devotional service of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So here it is mentioned, the description of the Vaikuntha world is mentioned, and in the end, here Prabhupada is saying, foolish people not knowing that Vishnu is the supreme worshipable object create so many worshipable objects in the material world and therefore they fall down. So we create many worshipable objects in the material world and that is the reason of a fall down. Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita also that devotees of less intelligence, ye api anya devata bhaktya yajante shraddhayanvitaha te api mameva hi kaunteya yajantya avidhi purvakam. They are actually avidhi purvakam worshipping the other devatas. They have made them as the object of worship. They create so many worshipable objects in the material world and therefore they fall down. So why do we create so many different worshipable objects in the material world? Is because we think that these different worshipable objects can give us pleasure, can give us happiness. Otherwise, why would we be worshipping them? We forget that actually the happiness, the pleasure that we are getting is actually coming from Krishna. It is only Krishna who has sanctioned it. Otherwise, we will not be getting. Now, even material pleasures that we get in this material, there was once we were discussing something about Gita and I was explaining to someone about how people are so attached to these material pleasures and actually these material pleasures are all illusions in the material world. So when I was telling like this, the person who was hearing, he told me that you cannot say that material pleasures are illusions, Swamiji. Material pleasures are there. We are all so happy. We are living in a nice apartment and we have nice family, we have nice children. There is so much of pleasure in this material world. So if you preach that material pleasures are illusion, people will call you are going through a depression and you should take anti-depression tablets and you should see a psychiatrist. How can you preach that there is this pleasure in the material world is illusion? So actually it's a fact. People see pleasure in the material world. But they don't. Why Prabhupada called this material pleasure an illusion? So he gives a very nice example how to understand that the so-called material pleasures in this world is actually an illusion. So it all depends on with what reference we are understanding. So he gives a very nice example. We are living as normal citizens. We are happy. We are enjoying. Now suppose you see a person who is drinking. He's a drunkard. And then if you ask him, why is that person drinking? Because there is pleasure. He is finding pleasure in drinking. If you tell that person who is drinking, look, you are suffering. He will tell you, he will not believe you. He'll say, how can you say I am suffering? I am actually enjoying, and actually he is enjoying the drinking. He knows he is enjoying the drinking, that's why he is drinking. But we, people who are not drinking, we know very well that his so-called enjoyment that he is finding in that drinking is actually such a low level of enjoyment that he thinks that to be the best pleasure and he is engaging in that. We know that if we don't drink, there are so many other nice drinks and so many other things to enjoy. So this is the illusion. A person who is actually engrossed in material things, thinks that he is happy, he is suffering, he is happy, he doesn't know that actually it's suffering, and there's a higher kind of pleasure available which is outside this drinking. So in the same way, we are engaged in our material activities and we think that everything is very nice, we are living a very happy life, and we are so absorbed in this happy life that we don't consider, we do not understand that there is a happy life beyond all these things, and that is in the spiritual world. And that happiness is like an ocean of happiness when considered, when compared to the happiness in the material world, which is just like a drop. So, the goal of life is to understand Vishnu. Nate vidu swartha gatim hi Vishnu. This is the goal of life, and this is what we should be engaged in this life, in this human form of life. Hare Krishna. ग्रंथराज श्रीमद् भागवतम की, शिला प्रभुपाद की, निताय गौर प्रेमानंद।